Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tomiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's program examining the enduring legacy of slavery and racism in the North. This discussion, like last month's event featuring Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times, is offered as a part of the Presidential Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, launched by President Larry Bacow last winter. The initiative is anchored here at the Radcliffe Institute, and we're committed to providing opportunities like this one for robust public conversations engaging with the complex histories that continue to shape our nation. You can learn more about the initiative at legacyofslavery-radcliffe.harvard.edu. Today's program is presented in collaboration with Harvard's Peabody Museum and the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture. We take as our starting point a new book co-published by the Peabody and the Aperture Foundation titled To Make Their Own Way in the World, The Enduring Legacy of the Zeely Daguerreotypes. This new volume is edited by Ilse Barbusch, Molly Rogers, and Deborah Willis. And it includes a wide-ranging collection of scholarly essays that attempt to illuminate not only the complexity of the Zeely daguerreotypes and what they represent, but also critically to explore the lives and the dignity of the individuals whom these images were meant to depict. The daguerreotypes are, as Jane Pickering writes in her preface to the book, vivid and visceral records of our country's original sin. They're also images of very real people: Delia, Renty, Jack, Drina, Jem, Facina, and Alfred. People who were systematically brutalized and commodified, and whose likenesses the Harvard professor Louis Agassiz hoped would provide evidence to support his racist theory of human origins. These daguerreotypes are emblematic of this institution's entanglement with slavery, the focus of the presidential initiative. For too long, Americans in the north of this country have cherished a narrative about widespread Northern opposition to the institution of slavery, privileging those stories over a more accurate and complete narrative about the ways that many Northerners were complicit in and benefited from slavery. This afternoon, as we explore the often overlooked history and enduring legacy of slavery and racism in the North, we'll also consider the importance of the daguerreotypes and other physical artifacts for understanding and reckoning with our past. To guide us in this critical discussion, we're joined by four scholars of slavery, race, and American history. Kiera Singleton is executive director of the Royal House and Slave Quarters, which was home to the largest slaveholding family in Massachusetts, a family that had significant ties to this university. Kiera is a PhD candidate in American culture at the University of Michigan. Manisha Sinha is the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut, a contributor to Make Their Own Way in the World, and the author of several award-winning books, including The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition. John Stouffer, also a contributor to the new book, is the Sumner R. and Marshall S. Cates Professor of English and of African and African American Studies at Harvard. He is the author or editor of more than 20 books about anti-slavery and photography. Moderating today's discussion is the distinguished public and academic historian, Taya Miles. Taya is a professor in Harvard's Department of History and a Radcliffe alumni professor here at the Radcliffe Institute. Taya also is a member of the faculty committee on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, which I'm fortunate to lead. I'm deeply grateful to Taya and others who are helping to guide this vital work. Thank you to Kiera, Manisha, John, and Taya for being with us this afternoon. Before I give the virtual floor to Kiera, I also want to acknowledge members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. Now for some logistics. In a moment, Kiera will kick off the discussion. At any point during the program, you can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your own questions for our panelists. We only ask that you keep your questions brief. With that, let's dive in. Kiera, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. In A Small Needful Fact, a poem written by the incomparable Ross Gay, award-winning African-American poet, about Eric Gardner, he reminds us of Gardner's time working for New York City's horticultural department. In the poem, he moves us away from only focusing on the violence of Gardner's murder at the hands of a police officer to think about the violence of not knowing Gardner beyond that moment. He ponders about the flowers that Gardner planted and the work that they continue to do for us, such as, and he writes, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe. So I want to begin my remarks here. When thinking about the enduring legacy of slavery in the North, I want to begin by thinking about the violence of forgetting, of not seeing. The legacy of slavery is all around us. It manifests in our built environments, the land we walk, the monuments on display, the institutions we teach in, and for me, quite literally, in the museum I lead. Although slavery existed in Massachusetts and in the North more generally, we often celebrate and talk about the North's legacy of abolitionism, a story that often, too often, is actually about white abolitionism in particular. Yet slavery was an important part of Northern society and its economy. Scholar Wendy Warren estimates that by the 1670s, more than half of the ships in Boston's harbor were going to and from the West Indies. This is important because I think people look at the region as a whole and they say, well, there weren't that many enslaved people, but numbers often obscure the truth. Scholars such as Jared Hardesty shows us that while enslaved people made up 4% of New England's population, when you actually look closely at places like Boston, that number jumps to 12%. And if we go right next door to Rhode Island, that number jumps to about 25%. In the interview between Carrie Mae Weems and Deborah Willis about the daguerreotypes, Weems says, social justice stems from examining the complexity of lived lives. While understanding demographics are important, we know that these numbers do not always tell a complete story. And so I ask, how does one tell a complex story of slavery? For me, I can talk about that through my work at the Royal House and Slave Quarters. At our museum, we know that some 60 people were enslaved by the royal family. While we know their names thanks to archival records, we don't have a ton of information about who they were or how they felt. In order to get to that interiority, we have uncovered objects through an archaeological dig that took place from 1999 to 2001. And through that dig, we found game pieces that were fashioned from tile or tobacco smoking pipes. And that has allowed us to begin to tell a complex story about how enslaved people experienced not only enslavement, but also leisure and how they made a life for themselves amidst the brutal violation of slavery. These objects have helped us reinterpret the site and to think through hard questions of agency and resistance while centering the lives of those who were enslaved. Questions that not so long ago, if we go back to the 90s, were considered taboo at our museum. However, one cannot talk about the beautiful colonial mansion of the royal family without talking about the people who built it and the indigenous land that it sits upon. In 2005, when the board changed the title from the Royal House to the Royal House and Slave Quarters, it was to ensure that people didn't only come to the site to think about the beautiful home and the furniture, but to think about who built that furniture, who tended to the land, who planted the trees and flowers, who cut the wood, who worked as blacksmiths, who cooked the food, who made shoes, and most importantly, who was enslaved against their will to generate immense wealth for a white family. We can begin to situate Belinda Sutton, a woman who, after claiming her freedom, petitioned the Massachusetts legislature for a pension from the royal estate. Although this happens in the 18th century, we can situate her in a long history of Black people, and in particular, Black women challenging slavery in the courts and defining freedom on their own terms, as well as leading the way in dismantling slavery. And in Massachusetts, that history goes back to the beginning of the 18th century. As attitudes shifted about slavery in the North, there were countless Black people, enslaved and free, who were at the forefront of that movement. And I think it's really important that when we start to think about how to talk about the enduring legacy of slavery in the North, that we really do situate the Black men and women who were leading the charge and putting pressure on the legislature around the American Revolution to redefine freedom and to say, hey, what about slavery? Since arriving at the Royal House and Slave Quarters, it's been important for me to remind people that it is a site of memory. And although we may never know more than a name, we still must remember. It is now my pleasure to pass the virtual floor to John Stauffer.
Mute myself. Thank you for that wonderful address. I want to focus on slavery in Massachusetts in the antebellum period and as a contextual framework for helping to understand Louis Agassiz. Massachusetts from the 1830s through the Civil War was arguably a state that experienced profound racism, but less than most other states. And the reason for that, the main reason for that is from 1830 to 1860, the percentage of the population in Massachusetts that was African-American was very small, 2%. And in fact, arguably, some scholars have suggested there was more racism against the Irish from 1830 through the Civil War, because the Irish constituted, by the 1850s, some 20%. The Irish were seen as a separate race. If you were an African-American male from 1830 to through the Civil War, you had you enjoyed unrestricted suffrage. If you were an Irish immigrant, there was beginning in the 1850s a literacy exam in order to vote. Massachusetts was the first state to overturn the ban on interracial marriage, the first state to desegregate schools, led by an interracial coalition, and they did so in 1855. The first state to admit Black jurors. And at Harvard in late 1850s hired an African-American instructor, Aaron Molyneux Hewlett, who became the first director of the Harvard Gymnasium. Hewlett had been an abolitionist. He contributed articles to William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator. He was seen as one of the most popular teachers at Harvard. He was called Professor Hewlett. Now that, again, the contextualization is that it's crucial to understand that African-Americans were not seen as a threat in Massachusetts because of their low numbers in the way they were in the Midwestern states, much more so. Even Connecticut, there was arguably far more racism in Connecticut. And Agassiz, who was born in Switzerland, he was a protege of one of the great scientists of his day, comes to the United States, was profoundly racist, and he represents on the spectrum of racism one of the extreme ends, because as a scientist, Agassiz advocated this theory of polygenism, where he tried to argue, which is part of the use or the purpose of commissioning these daguerreotypes as evidence. He tried to argue that Blacks were a separate species. People of African descent were a separate species. And Agassiz, as a scientist, as a biologist, is what Stephen Jay Gould called an extreme splitter. When he looked at fish or other animals, the minus difference or variation, he would declare that they're separate species. And he became famous for that in terms of, he was in his time considered the greatest scientist in discovering all these species of fish. He essentially, through his racism, employed the same strategy. And as if you've seen the if you've read the book and you've seen the horrible or the profoundly disturbing daguerreotypes of these enslaved people that Agassiz had commissioned from South Carolina, Agassiz has them, he has them posed in anatomical poses in the same way that he had fish and other animals posed. And what is, Agassiz received criticism in Boston and in anti-slavery circles for his racism and especially for his religion, because for a lot of religious people, for Agassiz to declare that blacks are separate species, that contradicted Genesis. Agassiz tried to get around that by saying that the Bible didn't include all of the Genesis stories. There is a Genesis story for Africans, there's a Genesis story for Chinese, there's a Genesis story for indigenous people, and the Bible just didn't include all of those, which is a creative but problematic way of getting around that. So what's fascinating, one of the fascinating aspects to me is in Boston, the way in which some of Agassiz's friends were prominent abolitionists. Longfellow was a friend of Agassiz and did not, in their correspondence at least, Longfellow did not try to enlighten Agassiz about his profound racism. Charles Sumner, who is the great civil rights senator who issues a civil rights bill in 1870 that becomes a foundation for the Brown v. Board of Education and for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Sumner does, in his private correspondence, take Agassiz to task for his racist views, but not publicly. They were unwilling to threaten this intellectual community, which Agassiz was a part of in Boston. Agassiz, I argue, or based on new evidence, one of the reasons that he does not disseminate these daguerreotypes as evidence for his polygenesis theory of people of African descent as a separate species is because of his reputation. Agassiz in 1850 he had close friends with South Carolinians, and South Carolina was essentially the hotbed of pro-slavery and arguably racist thought. He was also friends with a number of leading anti-slavery advocates, abolitionists in the North. And so as a way to try to try to juggle both groups, he put those daguerreotypes in a drawer, and in fact, were not discovered until 1976. And in fact, one reporter, when he presented them to the Cambridge Scientific Club meeting, said that they were not suitable for public presentation. And another reason is because of their nudity. In the North, a photograph of nudes were seen as below the pale or not acceptable in the way they were in the South. Agassiz is a kind of extreme racist. Manisha is going to talk more about the types of racism that is circulated in the North. Agassiz was, as I said, this profoundly extreme racism. And it's fascinating to me the degree to which some of his anti-slavery abolitionist friends and colleagues do not publicly confront him on that, which could have led to an important and rich discussion at the time. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I will share my screen with you right now. And I will also thank Dean Tomiko Brown, Nagin, and everyone at Radcliffe for making this session possible. So in my talk today, I want to pick up a little bit on what Kiera talked about, which is the history of Northern slavery. And I'm going to talk more about its afterlives. We know, of course, that the North abolished slavery. Most Northern states abolished slavery between 1777 and 1804. But what we had after that was, of course, not perfect equality. As John mentioned, except for a handful of New England states, most Northern states did not even give Black men the right to vote. And with the spread of Jacksonian democracy, they actually took away the right to vote from Black men. This includes Connecticut and Pennsylvania. So we have a situation in the North where racism and race is used to undermine Black freedom by people who are opposed to it. This is not true of everyone, but certainly there's a culture of racism, both intellectual and popular, that really undermines Black rights and Black citizenship. And this is from the start of the Republic. The author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, all men are created equal, but if Black people are enslaved, and he himself, of course, was a slaveholder, then why is it that they are not included in that sentiment? So are they less than human, lesser humans, or not fully human? And you can see the start of a very deliberate racist discourse in the North and in the West generally at this time. And Thomas Jefferson's notes in the state of Virginia speculates in some of the most crude versions of scientific racism that are taking place at that time. And of course, African-American abolitionists, they respond to that. And David Walker, in his famous Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, talks about how racist ideas would actually act against the emancipation of Black people and how it really does hurt them. He sees Jefferson as one of the founders, one of the great men of the Republic. And if he is speculating in these baseless notions of racial inferiority, what would the common American citizen, white citizen, think? And so African Americans take this charge of really combating racism right from the start. In fact, they make fun of these racial scientists. Olaudah Equiano, the Afro-British abolitionist, calls them the orangutan philosophers. So, sort of turning back at them aspersions that they were putting on people of African descent. This idea of using racism to justify slavery and to argue against Black rights, as John said, became very popular in mid-19th century, and it really fed into the pro-slavery argument. So people like Louis Agassiz is very much connected with what was known as the American School of Ethnology. All these scientific racists who are measuring people's skulls, the distance between their nose and their heads, and making these pernicious claims about inherent racial inferiority, whether it's intellect, beauty, sensibility, you name it, they make those claims. And this, in fact, is an illustration from Josiah Nott and George Gliddon's Types of Mankind. Nott is a doctor from Alabama, and he spends a lot of time using scientific racism to justify slavery. Now, the African-American response to this is mainly moral and ethical, beginning with James W.C. Pennington. You can see him here on the left, of course, Frederick Douglass in the middle, and William Wells Brown. They raise an ethical objection to this kind of speculations of racial science. William Wells Brown is interesting because he even challenges Thomas Carlyle when he's in England on his cult of Anglo-Saxonism, which became actually quite popular in intellectual circles in the Anglo-American world. So they're really taking on theoretically, and not just them, a whole slew of them, who I talk about. And we really need to counterpose these African Americans and the way they represented themselves, and then the way they challenge those ideas with those forlorn daguerreotypes that we have of enslaved people. Agassiz, of course, commissioned those, and they commissioned them in South Carolina, and he's fated in the South as having proved their theories of racial inferiority. Now, African Americans, as I said, there's a whole slew of them. They called it the American aristocracy of skin. I don't, the idea that they really need to challenge this. I'm not going to read everything here, but you can see that both Pennington and Douglass, just from the way I have quoted them, are raising moral and religious ideas, ethical objections to scientific racism. Of course, now we know that not only did they have the better ethics and morality, they also had the better science, because everything that Agassiz and his follower at Harvard, Nathaniel Shale, everything they said has, of course, been overturned. Now, it's not just Black men, Black women also self-represent in a way that challenges these kind of racist, misogynistic stereotypes. I'm thinking of Sojourner Truth and the way she put on Quaker garb, signaling her anti-slavery commitments to, or somebody like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was called the Bronze Muse of the abolition movement. They represented themselves in a way that would challenge the way scientific racists try to reduce Black humanity, try to reduce Black humanity into a caricature, or use it as a way to actually defend the enslavement of people of African descent. Now, this mode of arguing, of challenging Black equality by using intellectual pretensions to science, continues even with emancipation after the Civil War. And if you see, Louis Agassiz actually writes to Samuel Gridley Howe, who is in the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, and they're thinking of developing a government agency to oversee the transition from slavery to freedom. And he writes to Howe these things about racist ideas. Of course, he's a believer in polygenesis, as John said. He wants to say that you can't give Black people equal rights. And that in fact, even with emancipation, we need to use racial science to determine the amount of rights, the citizenship that people should have. And Howe, who is an anti-slavery man, somehow Agassiz's ideas make its way in his reports. And it's really, if you read his reports, it's schizophrenic. It has Agassiz's racial science and his own sort of anti-slavery belief in equal citizenship. So it is extremely pernicious. And after the fall of Reconstruction, you have the height of scientific racism and social Darwinism at the turn of the century. This is the same time when you have the institution of the Jim Crow era, the same time that you have racial terror and convict lease labor and debt peonage in the South. So these are not just theoretical speculations. They have real impact in the ways in which they justify the very rigid racial subordination of freed people, of people of African descent, even after emancipation. And it's not until the 1930s and until the Second World War makes racism unfashionable in Western academic circles that this mode of thinking of containing Black freedom through very crude speculations of racial science, that is completely done away with. It still persists, but it is no longer it does not enjoy the kind of cachet it did certainly there when Agassiz wrote, except for a handful of outliers. Most scientists would completely reject this. And interestingly enough, as John mentioned, it was really Stephen Jay Gould who brought out that entire history of scientific racism. Of course, he lectured at Harvard for a long time. And he talked about how the American School of Ethnology was not using scientific methods, but using ways to, in fact, justify both the enslavement and later on the containing of Black freedom. Thank you. And now I will hand over the virtual floor to our moderator, Taya Miles, who will lead the discussion right now.
Thank you, Manisha. My goodness, that was a lot in just 30 minutes. And I think that all of us here in this webinar have a sense of how much depth we could plumb if we continue this discussion for many more minutes. We've turned our attention in this discussion so far to the legacies of slavery and racism in this region, which are shaped by and dependent on the histories of the same. All three of you have presented on quite a broad temporal terrain. We've ranged from Kiara Singleton's comments about 18th century Massachusetts. We talked about abolitionism, the 1830s, the 1850s, and we talked about this moment right now to a certain extent in Kiara's comments about how it is that we can tell a complex story of slavery. You all have touched on a variety of categories and ways of approaching this past and engaging its legacies, from artifacts and poetry and objects as small as daguerreotypes and as large as mansions and estates, to ideas across a broad intellectual and ideological range, to contests and arguments between and among various individuals and groups. I'd like to start the discussion among the three of you with a question about this complexity, about this range, about this breadth. Why do you think it's so important for us to retain a sense of the positions, what was agreed upon, what was disagreed upon, where the tensions were as we look at this past? Manisha, I'll start with you, and then John, perhaps you can weigh in.
So I think that's a great question, Taya. I think the problem is that we forget how contested our past is. That these things have never been simply accepted, even though they were dominant discourses. So as I was writing the article for this book, and as I researched also in my book on abolition, I found that African Americans had always taken on these people, that they may have thought that they were hegemonic and dominant, but that in fact, right from the 18th century, you can see people of African descent contending this intellectually. Mm-hmm. They're writing books, they're writing pamphlets. In my article, I speculate, here's Agassiz in Cambridge, and some of these people are writing in Boston. Did they ever meet? Were they even aware of each other's existence? We know Sumner, for instance, was very much tied into the Black community in Boston. But the fact is that we need to tell that story too. We need to talk about that contestation rather than simply think that this is what was there, and that people resisted enslavement, etc., but that somehow there was no intellectual or theoretical response. And in fact, there was. We learn in school sometimes the famous exchange between Banneker and Jefferson. But then you look at the whole slew of Black abolitionists, they're still writing against Jefferson right up to the Civil War, because they think it's important to do that. And I think that would be my response to when we think about the past, to look at different archives, to think of it as a more contested past than we normally do.
I think that's very good. As I mentioned, is really disturbing is the number of anti-slavery and abolitionist whites in Boston who do not publicly and vocally contest the lies that Agassiz is spewing about race and racism. I mean, as it's been clear from the discussion, racism simply marinated American society, the entire North American landscape from the colonial period to my mind, through today. Taking a public stand against someone like Agassiz is what, as Manisha said, every African American did. They understood its danger. They understood the degree to which it could lead to the stripping away of equal rights, and certainly ideas of citizenship, equal citizenship in a democracy. And so having the courage to confront and expose these lies, I think is absolutely important. But there was a very committed effort among pro-slavery folk not to allow that to happen. I mean, one of the distinctions between the northern states, a crucial distinction between the northern states and the slave states, was that there was no freedom of speech, petition, debate, assembly. There was no civil liberties. It was essentially a totalitarian society in terms of there was a vigorous suppression of free speech and circulation as it related to race and slavery. Massachusetts was a publishing center, and there was far greater free speech, which is also, it makes it even more problematic that some of these white anti-slavery abolitionists did not use their voice to contest Agassiz in the way Black abolitionists, as Manisha said. I mean, Boston was the site or the home of many of the Black leaders in the United States. And they were very forthright. They were truly brilliant at disseminating and at trying to expose these lies, both in their in speeches and in writings and in letters to each other. So I think that's it's, you know, using your voice and making it public is absolutely crucial.
Indeed, contested ground then, contested ground right now. I'm going to turn the last question to Kira before we open it up for Q&A with the audience. Kira, how do you see this history as being important to us today? Why does it matter that we're here talking about these issues?
I think that's a really great question. I think, you know, in many ways, the way that I understand this history is that in order to understand our current moment, or in order to think about how we chart a path forward, we have to understand history, and we have to be able to take some pride, you know, in this history as well. I think hearing both Manisha and John talk about the ways in which Black abolitionists are, you know, very active. They're, you know, extremely a part of the intellectual scene. A lot of that gets lost. And I think when it comes to the history of slavery, some people don't want to, you know, deal with it because it feels like it's only coming from a place of pain. And I think that that is the way that we can complicate this a bit more, you know, for as much as we talk about the, you know, the brutality of slavery, there are also all of these, you know, Black abolitionists and activists, you know, pushing back and also, you know, saying that, you know, hey, you know, slavery is happening, but we're fighting against it as well, you know, and to not understand agency or resistance in some limited framework. I honestly think that in order to reckon with this moment, we have to reckon with the past. And in order to understand the afterlives of slavery, we have to understand slavery.
Well, with that, we are going to move into our audience Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question of the panelists, please enter your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And many of you already have done that. Please, if you can, keep your questions brief so we can have as much time as possible for this part of our discussion. I'm going to begin with a question that's asking about the daguerreotypes and asking about ownership and what the status of those images is right now. And John, I'd like to put that question to you as somebody who has assembled convenings about the daguerreotypes at Radcliffe over the years. Who owns the images right now?
The Peabody Museum owns the images right now. There is, as many of you know, a lawsuit, and so it's being contested by some, the people suing are, they have evidence that they are descendants from the slaves, and so it's in the court. And in my view, it's actually one of the positive things that came out of the enduring legacy of the daguerreotypes is this contestation over who owns who, should have control over the daguerreotypes. I know a number of people at Harvard are concerned about that, but I think it speaks to what Manisha said about the importance of contestation. The more that this becomes public, the more that Americans are going to become more aware of their profoundly racist past. And it raises crucial questions about who should be the rightful moral legitimate owners of these daguerreotypes. And a case could be made arguably for both the Peabody Museum, which serves the public. Anyone can go into the museum. There's a case and so serves the public to help to highlight this long history of racism and contestation. There's another argument that could be made that the descendants of, if they are rightful descendants, they have a legitimate claim as well. And they could also disseminate their voice as they have in terms of exposing this history and connecting it to the present. I mean, I've used the daguerreotypes in my teaching and in talks. They're very disturbing. It's crucial to contextualize it. But I also highlight that I've written a lot on photography. The best we know, African Americans sat for their photograph almost every chance they could because the photograph was seen as having a truth value. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed American in the 19th century. There are more separate photographs of Douglass than of Lincoln or of Grant or than anyone else. And he wrote on the way in which photography becomes a crucial aid in his reform work. And it's a way of exposing and countering all of the horrible racist stereotypes that most of you are familiar with that become even more rampant and widespread after the Civil War, with a widespread greater degree of racism, at least in visual imagery. And so I'll stop there.
Thanks for that, John. Your response allows us to pivot into a question about using images like these and artifacts of slavery in teaching. And I'll put this question to you, Manisha. How do you use such images without reliving the violence that they may represent? The questioner asks.
Well, I've actually never used the daguerreotypes in my teaching, but I have used the kinds of caricatures that I showed you. And it is really important for us to counterpose those images precisely with the kinds of images that John was talking about. African Americans were very keen to self-represent in a certain way. And to counter these kinds of images. I know that when it came to even things like lynching, there were lynching postcards, we have artifacts. If you look at the Without Sanctuary exhibition, there's so much in terms of the torture and pain of both slavery and after that of Jim Crow and, racial terror in the South after the fall of Reconstruction. Which just took off completely. And I take my guide from what the NAACP did. They wanted to show the horror, but they also wanted to evoke the humanity of people. And so when I teach African American history and I teach the history of, and I think it's true if you're teaching the history of the Holocaust, let's say, or even if you're talking about the genocide of Native Americans, when you read descriptions of massacres, even those descriptions can be very disturbing. But I think it is important for students to read that, to totally understand the horror that this kind of imagery and these kinds of institutions entailed. Those precisely are the reasons why we live with the afterlives of slavery. And it is important not for it to, what some historians call the pornography of pain or voyeurism. And a lot of people critiqued abolitionist literature for doing that. But then I looked at the people who were doing it, and many of them were, formerly enslaved people. who wanted to evoke empathy, who wanted to literally throw it on people's face. You know, you think of Douglas's first narrative and the blood flowing down in cupfuls from Aunt Hester's body. You know, they wanted people to be aware of that level of brutality and torture. You know, as Douglas famously put it, you know, pray tell me who is the barbarian here. And so, you know, it is important when we teach this to contextualize it, to precisely understand why people use such imagery. Some of our 21st century years are even not used to that, you know, melodramatic 19th century style of literally throwing it at your face. But I think it's important also not to misunderstand it as the pornography of pain or voyeurism. I think that's too glib. That those are our theoretical lenses, and those were not the ones that they employed when they wanted to showcase the torture of slavery for political purpose.
Thank you for that, Manisha. Kira, we have a question about your museum. Someone has asked if you could please tell us more about your museum, its name, its location, and I wonder if you could also connect with Manisha's point about context in terms of taking visitors through the home and through the slave quarters at your site.
Yes, so the museum's name is the Royal House and Slave Quarters. It's located in Medford, Massachusetts. It's a historical house museum. It basically showcases the history of the royal family and the people they enslaved. The museum used to sit on 500 acres. And so although the plantation does not look the same as it did in the 18th century as it does today, one of the things that we are committed to doing is to really thinking about how to tell the history of slavery in a way that it's not only correct, but also doesn't shy away from the truth. And I think, one of the ways in which that we do that is by very explicitly the interpretation of the museum. When you come into the museum, when you're into the main house, one of the places that we go through is the kitchen. And in the kitchen, you see that there are, beds, because in the inventories, we saw that there were enslaved people who slept in the kitchen. And so I think that there's a way when we're thinking about how do you represent this history, how do you showcase it, is that when we're thinking about labor and we're also thinking about intimacy, right? What does it mean that people are forced to sleep in the kitchen in which they work? What does it mean that right across from the hall is where the family takes their leisure time while people are on the other side, cooking and maintaining the household through forced labor, and then being forced to sleep in those spaces. And so I think by, going through the museum and presenting that history, it forces people to not look away, that every room that you go through, we're talking about enslavement. We're talking about people who are actually, were there, who walked those halls, who cleaned the furniture, who made the food, who walked up and down the stairways. And I think it's really, really important that we highlight the intimacy of slavery and the violence of enslavement, while also talking about the ways in which enslaved people made lives for themselves, oftentimes out of the sight of the royal family. And so you get that contrast. You think about the ways in which people are living on the site because of forced labor, and then the ways in which they are also creating time for themselves as well.
Thank you. We have so many incredibly thoughtful questions here, and I wish we could get them all in. We just have 10 minutes left, and so I'm going to try to combine some questions and make sure that we cover some of the historical material that people are wondering about as I do that. First, I think it's important for me to voice that one participant has raised a very important point, and that is, this is just a statement, I just want to say this out loud. The point of this person's comment is there is a tension, a problem, perhaps we should feel discomfort with reproducing images of enslaved people in a book when we can intuit that they probably would not have wanted to be there. I don't put this to you as a question. I just think it's important that we say that out loud, that we make that point about the distance between what an enslaved person might have wanted, and where we are right now with representing and publishing an enslaved person's, enslaved people's images. Let me go on and try to combine a couple of these historical questions and direct them to Manisha. We have questions about why slavery ended in the North earlier than it ended in the South. We have a question about slavery in Canada and whether or not we are able to bring Canada into our picture of slavery in the North. And Manisha, just tack one more on there. We have a question directed to you asking if you can please just briefly explain what debt peonage is.
Okay, so this is something that historians have debated for a long time, and the answer always was that slavery was not that economically important in the North. That Southern societies were plantation societies, their economies revolved around slavery in a way that the Northern economy did not. And I think that was too glib an answer because, in fact, we know that there were areas in the North highly dependent on slavery. You could go to the Hudson Valley in New York or the Narragansett Valley in Connecticut, or go to the slave ports, as Kiera mentioned, the trade with the West Indies. These people had a big stake in slavery. And they fought against emancipation. So the first wave of abolition, I think we really do need to look at, who are the people who are contesting slavery. They're African Americans themselves, they're the early abolition societies, and most states passed these gradual emancipation laws. But Northern slaveholders are not willing to let go. It's not that they're saying, oh, we have a minor economic stake in slavery, and therefore we're fine with emancipation. No, a lot of them actually try to get around those laws and sell their slaves down south or move down south themselves. And they do all kinds of things. And African-American men and women sue, they petition the legislatures. I mean, all this is in great detail in my book, so I wouldn't go too much into it because I know we don't have that much time. But what I'm trying to say is that the first wave of emancipation came about also because people fought against slavery. We had abolitionists even then. Black women, as Kiera mentioned, tended to sue for their freedom. In Massachusetts in particular, the freedom suits of two enslaved people, Quogue Walker and Elizabeth Freeman, Mumbet Freeman, waded all the way to the Supreme Judicial Court, which led Massachusetts to abolish slavery. So in Massachusetts, it came about because of the actions of African Americans themselves, that they are always contesting it. And I do think it is important to pay attention to the rise of that first wave abolition. It did not succeed in the South, even though there was widespread manumission in some of the border states, creating a large free Black population in some of the border slave states, but you did not have emancipation. I mean, even Delaware, 90% of its Black population was free on the eve of the Civil War, and they still refused to pass an emancipation law. So it kind of did hit a wall in the South. But I think it is important to remember that you did have a country that was half slave and half free, and that it was not the same thing for an African-American person contending against slavery to be in the North or in the South. I think it is important to retain some of those sectional differences, which sometimes we say, the whole country was racist, therefore there was no difference. Actually, there were important geopolitical differences. The other question about debt peonage, I was actually referring to the regime after the fall of Reconstruction, when you had sharecropping and convict lease labor. Debt peonage was a way that planters would forever, keep sharecroppers and tenant farmers locked into their plantations by selling them seeds and tools at outrageous prices. So no matter how hard they worked, what they got at the end of the year, their share of the crop or wages, whatever they got, was always less than what they owed the planter. So it was a form of peonage, a form of servitude, because you were kind of indebted and permanently attached to that place. So, we see these kinds of afterlives of slavery in the South in terms of the criminalization of Blackness, convict lease labor, debt peonage, sharecropping, which becomes a far worse system than when it first began. So that's what that meant.
Thank you. In our last 5 minutes, I am going to put a final question to John, and then we will have to conclude. John, a participant asks, was there any scientific method at all in scientific racism?
It's a great question. Was there any scientific? No. I mean, the foundation of scientific method is that you isolate variables and you examine in isolating variables, you can examine your subjects or your whatever you're examining as a way to arrive at quantifiable assessments. And there is in the antebellum period, there was just no effort really to do that. There was zero effort to do that. And in fact, Agassiz, as I said, he creates the School of Science. There was far more blurring between the humanities and the social sciences and the science. In fact, someone I've written on, James McCune Smith, who's the first professionally trained Black physician in the United States. He was born a slave in New York City. So he's born a slave in New York. He becomes free with the New York Emancipation Act. He applies to American colleges. He wants to become a doctor. So he wants to become a scientist. He's denied at all American colleges on account of his race. He ends up receiving his BA, MA, and MD degree at the University of Glasgow in Scotland in 5 years and returns. And he writes some articles that are scientific, where he does analysis. And in fact, Glasgow in Scotland was a site of some of the great statistical innovators. Quitlet is one of them. He also wrote literary pieces. He's actually the only known African-American to write on Moby Dick and Melville's brilliant kind of explosion of racial ideas in the way in which the white whale in Moby Dick is mostly non-white, mostly Black. The reason he's called white is just because of the brow, which is what everyone sees. So in any event, McCune Smith understands that in certain topics there can be quantifiable analysis and others not. And he was truly brilliant at, because of his training, just exposing the fictions of the School of Ethnology. It just absolutely exposed him. In fact, Frederick Douglass, in his writings on ethnology, he was a close friend of Frederick Douglass, and Douglass was indebted and acknowledges this to McCune Smith's training.
Thank you. Always apropos to end with Mr. Douglass.
Yes.
So this concludes our program for today. And I'd like to thank Kiara, John, and Manisha for your very thoughtful presentations. And I'd like to thank the audience as well for your serious and sensitive questions. Again, I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. They were wonderful. This program was presented as part of the Presidential Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, a university-wide effort housed at the Radcliffe Institute. It was co-sponsored by the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology and Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, to whom we're also grateful. I hope you can attend other Radcliffe virtual programs this year. You can find out about future programs and past programs at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you for joining us, and take good care.